A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. On a Sabbath, Jesus went to dine at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, and the people there were observing him carefully. He told a parable to those who had been invited, noticing how they were choosing the places of honor at the table. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not recline at table in the place of honor. A more distinguished guest than you may have been invited by him, and the host who invited both of you may approach you and say, "Give your place to this man," and then you would proceed with embarrassment to take the lowest place. Rather, when you are invited, go and take the lowest place, so that when the host comes to you, he may say, "My friend, move up to a higher position." Then you will enjoy the esteem of your companions at the table. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Then he said to the host who invited him, "When you hold a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your wealthy neighbors, in case they may invite you back and you have repayment. Rather, when you hold a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Blessed indeed will you be because of their inability to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of the Lord. The year is 1215. Pope Innocent III convenes what is arguably the most important ecumenical council of the whole Middle Ages, so from 600 to 1500. It's known as the Fourth Lateran Council. And at this Fourth Lateran Council, the dogma of transubstantiation is defined. Transubstantiation is that belief we have that the Eucharist it's not just a symbol of Christ's body and blood, but it becomes, in reality, Jesus' body and blood, though retaining the appearance of bread and wine. Like most doctrines of the church, there was no need to define it for the first 1,200 years because there was really no argument about it. But usually it's when something gets argued about, that's when we have to define it. Like we didn't have the books in the Bible were never defined as the canon until the 1500s because there was never any argument about it. So in the same way the Eucharist never needed to be defined, there was no argument. But in the 1100s, the 1200s, there was this argument whether it's just a symbol or in reality actual body and blood of Christ. About 50 years after the council defined it, there was a priest by the name of Father Peter. He was a German priest. And Father Peter was very, very much confused and struggling because he was reading, theologians who were like, no, the Eucharist is just a symbol, and other theologians who were like, no, it's the reality. And he was like, they're all smarter than me. I don't know what to do. And so he decided he was going to take a pilgrimage to Rome. And he was going to pray at the tomb of St. Peter, his patron. And he was going to pray for the grace to be able to believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. So Father Peter, he takes off, and one of his stops is in Bolsena, Italy. He stops for the night to stay at a church, St. Catherine's. The next morning he wakes up and he says Mass as usual. And as he's praying the words of consecration, he's got these doubts, these struggles running through his mind and in his heart, and he's saying those words, "Take, eat, this is my body." As he prays those words of consecration, the host begins to bleed. And he's obviously shocked at this miracle unfolding before him. He takes the host and he wraps it up in the corporal, which is the white cloth we lay out on the altar. And he knows that the Pope Urban IV, is at a nearby town of Orvieto. And so he takes the host to the Pope. The Pope has some experts look at it and determine it is real blood, and that this is a Eucharistic miracle. And the corporal itself, the bloodstained corporal, if you ever go to the cathedral in Orvieto, it's enshrined above the altar to remind us of this Eucharistic miracle that kind of confirmed the statement of the Fourth Lateran Council. Now, Pope Urban himself, he was kind of struggling with God, because when he was a bishop, he started the Feast of Corpus Christi in his local diocese. And so now he was Pope, and he was like, God, should I make this Feast of Corpus Christi a universal feast for the whole church? Right? And this confirmed it for him. So the very next year after this miracle, 1264, was the first time that the whole Catholic Church celebrated the solemnity of Corpus Christi, which we still celebrate to this day, usually around the end of June. One of my favorite tidbits is that Pope Urban, he hired a Dominican to write the music for the new Mass of Corpus Christi. The Dominican's name was Thomas Aquinas, a very brilliant theologian, became a saint. And so one of my absolute favorite hymn is, it's called Adore Te Devote, I adore you devoutly, which I convinced our music people to sing today. So we'll do that later. But, you know, when you pray these words, you know, when we sing those words, imagine like that's an 800-year-old hymn, really thanking God for the Eucharist and what the Eucharist really is. So the 1200s became a really blessed time in the life of the church, because in the midst of this struggle to understand the Eucharist, there was a flourishing of love and affection for the Eucharist, and adoration began to develop a lot during that century as well. I share it because a couple weeks ago, there was a poll that came out of the religiosity of Americans. And in the poll, there was one question on the Eucharist. And it was, do Catholics believe that the Eucharist is actually the body and blood of Christ, or is a symbol of the body and blood of Christ? And the results of the poll was that 70% of Catholics believed it was a symbol of the body and blood of Christ, including a third of those who go to Mass every weekend. So it kind of made its rounds in the priest circles and theologians, and really wondering, like, are we kind of at a time like in the 1200s where there's this doubt or this struggle with understanding Christ really truly present in the Eucharist, right? One thing is the questions were actually worded not the best, because they were actually both true. The Eucharist is a symbol, but it's also the reality, right? It's both symbol and reality. It's not merely or just a symbol, and it didn't really specify that well. So there's that element, but it challenges us, and it gives us the opportunity to kind of go back to be renewed in our faith. One of our most fundamental beliefs as Catholics is Christ present with us in the Eucharist. Bishop Gaynor wrote a letter to all of us as priests, and he asked us to do a little self-examination and really reflect on how we are, have we fallen, kind of started taking for granted Christ's great gift, right? And so he just kind of challenged us as a church to use this time to really be renewed in that. And so I was thinking and praying, and I've decided, I think, for the month of September, right? And so we got, I think, like 5 weekends here in September, just to use this time to be renewed in our understanding, in our love, and our affection for the Eucharist. And so each week I'll preach on some kind of topic, whether it's kind of the apologetics of what we believe, or what are the graces that we receive in the Eucharist, or just kind of really diving into this most blessed and important of all sacraments. So today, just real briefly, I think the letter to the Hebrews, which was our second reading, gives us a fantastic starting point. So the letter to the Hebrews, it's written to a bunch of Hebrew Christians, so Christians who had converted from Judaism. And it's they've been Christians for about 20 years. And there was this real struggle in the early church, that they were struggling with wanting to go back to the old old sacrifices, the Old Testament sacrifices and rituals, because they were so visceral. Like, you would go to the temple, the glorious temple, and gold and everything, and you would take the lamb and you would lay your hands on the lamb to put your sins into that sacrifice, and you would kill it and you would burn it, and it was so powerful of an experience. And now all they were doing was gathering together in homes, taking bread and wine, these very kind of basic elements, these basic foods. And so it was the first instance really where people were complaining of being bored, right, at Mass, right? Because they wanted all the excitement that they had, right? And so this is why the author to the letter, as we heard in the second reading, he says, yes, we don't draw near Mount Sinai. We don't go to that place where there was thunder and lightning and loud noises and smoke and clouds and trumpets blaring, right? We don't go there. But what we do approach, right, and he's kind of describing when you get together in your homes around the altar with Christ, what you're approaching is the New Jerusalem with angels and festal gathering, with the assembly of the firstborn enrolled in heaven, right? Things that we can't see, but are the reality of what is before us, right? Angels are gathering here. The saints are with us. And he says, you gather around Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and his blood, which speaks more eloquently than even Abel's blood. So there's this sense that he was trying to, get the new Christians to understand when they gather for the Mass, right, that they're coming and they get to gather around Jesus, and they get to receive his blood poured out for the salvation of the world. He says, that's more incredible than all those other sacrifices we long to go back to. And so I would just challenge us in two ways. One is to give thanks to God for the accessibility of the Eucharist, right? He uses bread and wine, which are two very, very basic elements, two basic foods, so that he could be present in every location, in every epoch of history, right? The fact that he uses such simple things means that he can be present anywhere, everywhere, for all time, right? And sometimes we can just, get bored of the simplicity, but it's the simplicity that gives us the accessibility to God, right? And how great and powerful is that of a mystery? So we thank God, and we have to praise him for that mystery and his accessibility. And we have to pray like Father Peter of Prague. We have to ask Jesus for the grace to be able to believe more deeply in the Eucharist and in his real presence. Because it's only by God's grace can we believe in such a mystery. Right? God has to give us the grace to believe. And so we praise God, we thank him for his accessibility, and we ask him for the grace to be able to believe more deeply.